In this lesson, we are still talking about the engagement acceptance and continuance process. We are narrowing in a little more to the entity itself and dealing with things that are specific to the entity. Canadian auditing standards require that certain conditions be in place before the engagement can be accepted. These are called preconditions. The first precondition to consider is that the financial reporting framework must be acceptable to the engagement. The financial reporting framework is typically either International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS, Accounting Standards for Private Enterprises, or ASPE, Accounting Standards for Not-for-Profit Organizations, or ASPE-NPO, Public Sector Accounting, or some other framework. Examples where a financial reporting framework would not be acceptable would include using ASPE versus IFRS for a public company, using ASPE versus ASPE-NPO in certain situations, such as for a not-for-profit organization, or using ASPE-NPO versus public sector accounting for a government entity. If these types of situations arise and management is not willing to employ the correct framework to something acceptable, then the preconditions are not met. Another precondition is with respect to special purpose financial statements. If the potential client needs a special purpose financial statement, you need to understand the purpose for the financial statements, and you need to understand who the intended users are. Depending on the situation, consideration may need to be given for any unusual reporting requirements to be within the standard. It will be important to ensure that the framework, the users, and the statements can all come together in order to enable you to comply. The next precondition, and it is a long one, regards management's agreement. Management must agree that it acknowledges and understands its responsibilities, and this acknowledgement or discussion of such must be documented. Management must agree to its responsibility for the preparation of the financial statements within the applicable financial reporting framework and their fair presentation. For internal control adequate to enable the preparation of the financial statements. For the provision of all relevant information applicable to the audit. For the provision of additional information you may request, and for unrestricted access to persons within the entity for the purposes of obtaining evidence. Because this is a precondition, and because you have not officially accepted the engagement yet, you need to ensure that there is some sort of documentation which indicates that you have had a discussion with management and that they agree with the conditions. Documentation could consist of a record of a conversation at a meeting, which includes the name, date, and person with whom the conditions were discussed and agreed to. This agreement will be reiterated later in the engagement letter. However, the precondition must exist prior to acceptance. If any of the items or conditions are not satisfactory and management will not agree, the preconditions are not met. If any of the preconditions cannot be met, you cannot accept the engagement. Next, we will discuss other factors that affect engagement acceptance. We have been on engagement acceptance for quite a while now. However, there are a few more factors that have to exist in order to accept the audit engagement. To start, there must be a rational purpose for the audit. You need to be satisfied that there is a rational purpose for the engagement. This may seem like an odd requirement, however, the consideration does need to be made. So that leads to the question, when would there be no rational purpose to performing an audit engagement? Keep in mind that the purpose of an audit is to be able to form an opinion as to whether the financial statements are fairly presented. If a situation exists that would prevent you from coming to that opinion regardless of your audit work done, there might not be a rational purpose for the engagement. Consider things like whether there are sufficient records and access to information. Another factor would be whether the audit engagement is appropriate. You need to be satisfied that an audit engagement is appropriate in the circumstances. Again, when would an audit engagement not be appropriate? Sometimes an entity may need an audit due to reporting and other requirements. However, sometimes situations change where the audit engagement may no longer be required. If management is not aware that such a requirement is no longer necessary, and if they have no other need for an audit, the engagement may not be appropriate. This does not disclaim, however, the fact that management may desire an audit engagement for personal or other business purposes, even though the requirement no longer exists. In this case, it may very well be appropriate. Affecting factors also require us to be able to meet the ethical requirements. You need to be able to meet the ethical requirements throughout the entire term of the engagement. The acceptance process, although done at the beginning of the engagement, constitutes the entire scope of the audit process, which means that if a situation occurs later on during the engagement, you may not be able to meet the relevant ethical requirements. As an affecting factor, this may require you to halt the engagement. A good example of a potential ethical requirement is where you are dealing with a client, and let's say perhaps that during the course of the engagement, the client starts to intimidate you. You may no longer be independent, which means that you do not meet the relevant ethical requirements. As such, you do not meet the acceptance requirements. An additional affecting factor is that the information required must be available and reliable. This can be important and is an assessment that should be made and documented during the acceptance process. This documentation is not always met. If for some reason you do not believe the documentation will be available or reliable, it could affect your ability to accept the engagement. Also, management must have sufficient integrity. We have talked about this already. However, sometimes we believe that management does have integrity, but circumstances come up that brings that into question during the audit process. Again, because acceptance factors need to be in place during the entire audit process, you may find yourself in a position where you no longer meet the requirements. And finally, you must believe that no scope limitations will be imposed. Management must agree to the terms as part of the acceptance process, to everything required. Even if they agree, you must assess whether you think they will follow through, and that assessment must also include those charged with governance. If there is any question to the items brought up in this lesson, changes must be made through agreement with management to satisfy yourself with